Welcome to the Academic Decathlon Section 3, Part 3 of our Science Resource Guide. So, we're going to be talking about agricultural resources. So, let's just start by, what started agriculture? And that is humans, they started by at hand, scavenging, gathering plants, hunting animals, hunting and gathering, what we know already. And roughly 12,000 years ago, then people started to actually farm and cultivate the soil, domesticate and raise animals, and domesticate or modify certain wild species of plants and turn them into crops. So they took plants and they were like, yo, we can plant these in the ground. That's amazing. Oh my goodness. So this actually allowed people to move beyond just subsistence level. They don't just exist to feed themselves anymore. Now they can do other things. But it did have some negative consequences. So, one factor is that there was the exponential growth of the human population, which whether or not that's a negative consequence is up to the person, but the deliberate cultivation of food was also the beginning of a level of environmental degradation never experienced on Earth. So, environmental degradation happens sometimes when you start to go cultivate food. It can ruin the soil, as we've talked about in previous sections. And so some people contend that agriculture collectively has been the most harmful human endeavor in terms of impact to the environment. So some do believe that agriculture can be the most harmful human impact on the environment. Now, where did it first develop? Well, it was in the Fertile Crescent, which is part of present day Middle East, China, Mesoamerica, which is southern, North, and Central America. So that Mesoamerica, middle uh, and Africa, Southeast Asia, and lowland South America. All of these developed around the same time and it spread, allowing local culture and habitats. These local constraints on agriculture development actually had to do with those suitable plants in that area for domestication, climate, settlement patterns, and population density. So these are the constraints which agricultural development faced while first coming into human civilization, which was domestication. So for animals, who's actually able or what animals are actually able to be domesticated? Climate, what's the climate like? We can't grow certain crops in certain times of the year because of the climate. And then settlement patterns, where are people actually settling, and population density, how many people actually are there in a single little area. So this little caption here says, in semi-arid environments such as the Serengeti ecosystem in Tanzania, uh, people can only use soil it through nomadic herding. So we're going to talk about nomadic herding later on. Actually, we're going to talk about it right now. But let's take a look at what are some of the traditional agricultural methods. And so there's a lot of different approaches we can take to soil and crop resources, depending on, once again, local conditions, the local constraints on agriculture development. So, a floodplain, such as that along the Mekong River in Southeast Asia, this allows water to flow out of the banks of the rivers and flood the valleys, which allows for nutrients and soil particles to be delivered to surrounding soil. So the Mekong River in Southeast Asia allows for more nutrients to flow around it. And this is superb for agriculture. Then in semi-arid environments, such as the Serengeti ecosystem in Tanzania, uh, this is only only nomadic herding works. So this is where they move herds of animals over long distances to seasonal feeding grounds. And so if the soil was used anymore, so this is a very intensive use of the soil, and any more of it would degrade the dry, fragile, nutrient-poor soils to where they would not be viable. So the soil is then used for transporting animals, if anything. So this is a very intensive use we can see because it's on the brink of being way too dry. And when it becomes too dry, fragile, and nutrient poor, this is called desertification. Then we take a look at, okay, well, with what about warm climate with moderately nutrient-rich soils? So like rainforests of Central or South America. Well, a lot of the nutrients are in the vegetation rather than in the soil. So there's a lot of plants that surround the soil and grow out of the soil, but a lot of the soil itself doesn't have all those nutrients. And so many people practice slash and burn agriculture, in which they clear the land and then, um, in order to grow crops or graze animals, as said here, and they then, so they cut down all of the vegetation, which means all of that vegetation is made into ash. It's burned into these piles. And this ash is then rich in potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And so this is good fertilizer for the crops or grasses. So remember that O layer, that organic layer. Well, at forest floors, that happens, and we can actually promote this through slash and burn agriculture. And so Europeans actually, when they colonized North America, they cut large forest trees, such as in North America, and um, this also happened with the woody vegetation or brush in Central America and the Amazon basin. So these main locations are where lots of cutting of forest trees happened. So such as when Europeans colonized North America. So I can imagine a question being something along the lines of, in North America, what did colonizers do to the forest to increase agriculture? And it was cutting large forest trees. So notice once again, we've got potassium, calcium, and magnesium now. So this isn't potassium and nitrogen like we've talked about in previous sections where is it? Nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus allow for water organisms to increase their production, whereas here it's the potassium, calcium, and magnesium, which makes for good fertilizer. Then eventually this ash is depleted, and so this actually can really hurt the climate because it's only a temporary fix. And then if desertification has occurred in an area of heavy rainfall, some may be washed away along with some of the soil. So this reduces the nutrient content as well as the thickness of the soil. Um, so overall, if we have heavy rainfall, that means that all those nutrients are being washed away from the dirt, and the soil doesn't get those nutrients then. And so this reduces both nutrient content and thickness of the soil. Then we get the idea of, okay, well, how is this degradation happening over larger areas? Well, farmers just move to a new place, a new plot of land, and they repeat it. So if it's used for a few years and then abandoned, the vegetation actually has a chance to regrow. So this actually allows for more productivity in the land. But if it's just brought back to and it's continually used without being stopped, and you don't abandon it for a number of decades where vegetation can grow again, um, if you don't do that, then its productivity decreases. So if the land is continually used without chance to recover, its productivity decreases. But if you move on to a new plot of land, then over time nutrient supplies they increase, even soil properties and organic content and soil structure can recover from this form of agriculture. And This can actually provide subsistence for a family, but usually can't create surplus at a larger scale. And so another side effect, a broader one, is that slash and burn agriculture actually releases carbon emissions from burning into the atmosphere. And then usually subsistence farmers don't use chemical fertilizers because they're not available or affordable, but instead they use animal and plant waste as fertilizers. So these are some more traditional agricultural methods of using plant and animal waste as that fertilizer. And they could also practice intercropping, where they plant two or more crop species at the same time in order for this synergistic interaction. So what type of agriculture promotes synergistic interaction? Well, it's intercropping because two or more crop species are planted at the same time in the same field. So for example, corn, it takes in a lot of nitrogen. Remember, some of the most essential elements for agriculture are potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And in this case, we're just adding in more nitrogen. These could be planted alongside nitrogen fixing crop such as peas. So peas are nitrogen fixers. So you may be asked the question of like, if you were to plant a field of a crop that needs a lot of nitrogen, which crop would you most likely want to plant alongside this plant of yours? And the answer would be peas. And they might even add an option of corn, but you don't want to get tricked. It's the peas that produce the nitrogen. It's the corn that takes in the nitrogen. Crop rotation. This allows for rotating species in specific orders, and some of these traditional practices are actually being revived currently in what is known as organic agriculture in the United States and Europe. We'll discuss the Green Revolution and how that has impacted agriculture as a whole. So, in the decade 1940s, researchers in Mexico, they started to think about, okay, how can we increase our agriculture in order to help developing nations with their growing populations, including themselves. And so they then developed strains of wheat that were disease resistant, and then they used fertilizer and irrigation to produce greater crop yields. So fertilizers and irrigation are an important part of the Green Revolution, and so are developing specific strains that are resistant to disease. So resistance, fertilizers, and irrigation. And wheat production then increased a ton to where it became an exporter of wheat, which allowed India and Pakistan to avert famines, so they were able to eat enough. And the leader of this project was Norman Borlaug, who was an American crop scientist, and he was awarded the 1970 Nobel Peace Prize for this work of his. And Norman, it's a nice name. I feel like Norman is such like a just a it's like the name Chad. Like I feel like Norman is another one of those names where it's like, yeah, he's a Norman. Like he's cool. He's doing well for agriculture. And he also seems like he would work with agriculture, this Norman man. Norman Borlaug. So he won the Nobel Prize in 1970, Nobel Peace Prize specifically, for this project. And so then after Mexico had success with wheat, from the 1950s to the 1970s, different countries started to shift agriculture as well, including the Philippines with rice. So the Philippines had success similar to Mexico in their rice production. And then this is called the Green Revolution because it's the development of better varieties of domestic animals and crops with intensive use of synthetic fertilizers, management techniques, and machinery, all to increase food production rates. So when you think Green Revolution, this should not be like, oh, we are really helping the environment a ton more. No, we're increasing food production. We want more of that good old yummy food for this Green Revolution. It's a revolution of the greens, that food that we eat every day from the 1950s to the 1970s. Yeah, that's right. You weren't even alive, I bet. Isn't that crazy? Yeah. Okay, so moving forward, what did the Green Revolution consist of? Well, we just listed them. Domestic animals, crops with intensive use of synthetic fertilizers, management techniques, and machinery. We're industrializing. Yes. So we also had an intensification of agriculture through techniques such as monocultures, which are agricultural plantings of a single species. And then we also had irrigation, increased intensity and or frequency of cropping. So we have a couple things that are actually questionable for the environment, which we'll get into later. But from the mid 1960s to the mid 1980s, world grain production increased by a factor of two. So over the mid 60s to the mid 80s, that factor of two is very important. It's doubling, that means. Or actually, increasing by a factor of two. You need to be careful about that wording there. So then by the 1990s, there were at least 18 centers around the world which promoted and developed green revolution technology. So by the time the 1990s hit, green revolution is everywhere. 18 centers around the world, a whole lot. So remember, they might ask you how many centers around the world promoted and developed techniques for the green revolution in the 1990s, and your answer would be 18. So as I was mentioning, it's not without its downside. So synthetic fertilizers and irrigation, especially with large plantings of single crops, can reduce variety of crops, which lowers biodiversity as a whole. Then we also had production of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, which actually uh, has increased productivity of farmland, but it relies on fossil fuel, natural gas, in order to create it, and it's a major source of non-point source water pollution discussed previously. So nitrogen here, remember nitrogen and potassium as those different non-chemical pollutants into the water? Well, we're using more of those because of nitrogen fertilizer here, and this is a non-point source water pollution, which is harder to manage. And so these actually exclude small, lower income, not just all of these bad stuff that's happening, but small, lower income family or subsistence farms uh, can't be included in all of these new green revolution techniques because they don't have the money to sustain such agriculture, whereas larger commercial farms they're thriving. And so this has actually increased poverty among rural farmers, and they've been displaced to cities in order to survive. And then there's also been a loss of individually held land to larger agribusinesses. So the larger agribusinesses are getting more land, and the individuals are having to give up their land to all those large agribusinesses. Then in 1960, there were roughly 4 million farms in the United States. So now there's actually half that number. So that's because all of these individually held lands are being given to the large agribusinesses. So 4 million to 2 million, or half the number, in 1960. Then we begin to ask a question, actually. I'm going to ask you a question about world grain production, and that is how much has it increased between mid 1960s and mid 1980s? It will be by a factor of two, it has increased. That's correct. Okay, so next up is status of world food production. So how much are we actually producing? And that is, we roughly 38% of all global land, or 5 billion hectares, 50 million square kilometers, is being used as agricultural lands, with 1/3 as cropland and 2/3 with meadows and pastures for grazing livestock. Think about that. Livestock takes up 2/3 of 38% of the global land surface. So that's what, like 20 something percent of the global land surface is for grazing lands livestock. And then like, I want to say like 15% is for, or let's just say like 22 and 16, or maybe even 23 and 16, or and 15%. The 15% is for cropland alone. And this is 5 billion hectares, which is about 50 million square kilometers. So they might even ask you really tricky questions like 5 billion hectares is how many square kilometers? It's 50 million. So divide by 100 and you're in square kilometers. It seems like from hectares to kilometers. Now, although this production of grain increased overall, all of that land has actually gone down. There's less land that's under grain cultivation since 1950, which reflects improvements that enabled growers to get more output from the same or smaller land area. So the improvements didn't mean we're using the same amount of land, it means we're using less land to produce the same amount. Now, most of the production increases have already largely been realized. And so now we are beginning to see the limitations of arable land. So arable means suitable. So arable land means, are we able to grow crops on it? We're actually starting to face limitations in that because we've found all of the, or most of the production increases that we can, and we are starting to run out of that water and arable water and land here that are good for growing crops and plowing. So this is very important to understanding, like, okay, how much is actually being produced in the world? And now we can get into, well, what is being produced? So 30 plant species provide 95% of the calories and nutrients for human beings. So literally just 30 plants. And then 6 crops only provide 80% in the human diet. So 80% is for 6, 95% is only 30 plant species. So these are wheat, rice, maize, which is corn, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and manioc. So just remember that those 6 crops, wheat, rice, corn, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and manioc. You think of like potatoes and sweet potatoes as like, I don't know, a good hearty dinner that you'd have. And then a manioc, I don't even know what manioc is. Let me actually look that up real quick. Manioc. Is he gonna tell me? It's like a, oh, it's a yucca. It's like a it looks like a potato, but it's not. Okay, so all of these are making up 80% of the calories. And then we also have 8 other crops which create a balanced diet. So this includes sugar cane, sugar beet, common beans, soybeans, barley, sorghum, coconuts, and bananas. So sorghum, I feel like I see this on the back of a lot of nutrition labels. And then coconuts and bananas. So this would make sense. Now, coconuts and bananas are unexpected because they're tropical. But if you think about it, you can put coconuts over your ears, and that's why they're really useful. And then bananas, you just kind of go bananas. Also, if you think about it, for humans like bananas, I mean, that makes sense that we would like them because, monkeys are very similar to us. And, we love bananas just like monkeys do. And then sugarcane, that's actually kind of unexpected that sugarcane is needed for a rounded out balanced diet, but alas, we do. And so we have sugar beet as well. So like the two sugars, the sugar cane and the sugar beet, they were once separated, but now together in the human diet they stand. Then we have common beans, soybeans, and barley. So barley we can think of as very similar to wheat. But it's not wheat, so it's part of the eight other crops. And then the soybeans are just similar to the common beans. I mean, beans are pretty important to the human diet as well. Now, what are the top four food crops that are produced worldwide? Well, wheat, rice, corn, and potatoes. This makes sense, right? Because those are part of the six crops that provide 80% of the calories. And these wheat, rice, and corn, not potatoes, along with barley, which remember is part of the eight, oats, rye are all considered grasses. And then the fruits of these grasses are called cereals. So if we take the little fruits off of you don't expect fruits to come from grasses, but alas, that's what cereal is fruits from grasses. And so they're good as sources of carbohydrates and calories. So these also contain protein, oils, vitamins, and minerals, which are very important to our diet. And different crops have different relative proportions, but they serve as basic foods for many, many people. Then we have potatoes, which are known as tubers, and these are a staple carbohydrate, which means they're like a carbohydrate. They have lots of carbs in them, that is very prominent in the world, and they're a great part of the developed world mostly for and have been for centuries. And a lot of these have to do with growing temperatures, once again, available moisture and available sunlight. So remember, we're going back to, well, what limits do we have on agriculture? And we have food insecurity. So how many people lack access to adequate amounts of food? 828 million people. This is from chronic hunger or undernourishment, and this means they don't have enough calories to exist in a healthy state. They aren't healthy with undernourishment. Now, an average person needs about 22 kilocalories per day. Although, of course, this varies with age, size, and sex, but alas, this is for the average person, 2,200 kilocalories. Now, with only 100 to 400 kilocalories per day less, with about 1,800 kilocalories, a person will not have enough to carry out the daily activities at full capacity and much more susceptible to poor health. So, if we have 2,200 kilocalories per day that we need at least, then uh, we need that amount. But if we get less at about 100 to 400 kilocalories less, let's just say the 400 number because it's 1,800 kilocalories, then we aren't going to have enough energy and we're going to be susceptible to poor health. Now, usually people would respond and say, why don't we grow more food then? And then we'll be okay and we have enough food for everyone. But this is the perspective that we already don't have enough food, when in reality, we do produce enough calories for everyone to have a healthy diet. Now, on the other hand, we will need to increase the food production by 60% to feed the larger human population of 2050 and after. But right now, we are creating um, enough to provide everyone on Earth with a healthy diet. So it's the United Nations that are claiming that 60% more, we're going to increase it by 2050 in order to sustain the human population. So if we take a look at some of these estimates, this is something important to memorize. 24,000 people starve to death each day worldwide, which is very young and very old people usually. We talked about the 868 million people lacking adequate amounts of food. They are food insecure, and there are over 1 billion people in the world who have diseases because of poor nutrition or overnourishment. So they may be obese. Over 1 billion people. Think about how many more people we could feed as well. Now, why is starvation a problem? Well, it's because half of the grain grown, it goes to livestock. And two of the top cereal crops, corn and soybeans. So we talked about what are these actual crops? Well, they're corn and soybeans. These are usually mainly for animals. Whereas people in the US are actually eating a whole lot of meat because they're feeding their livestock and then eating that meat. They have actually average 270 pounds, which is 123 kilograms of meat every year in the US. Uh, People in the US are averaging 270 pounds of meat with 123 kilograms, that's also known as. And this could mean that people are eating more than a pound of meat every single day. And so that's actually a whole lot of meat to be considering that some people are eating that much, since some people don't eat meat. Now, eating grain is actually much more efficient than meat, if we recall in section 2, talking about energy pyramids and such. So, if we were to only eat grains, we'd actually avoid malnutrition. And we'd actually, in order to do that, though, we'd have to have the right combinations, such as grains and legumes, in order to get protein, and vegetables in order to get vitamins and minerals. But if we were to just eat grain, we would be able to feed a lot more people with the same amount. Now, we can also think about this in terms of the grain multiplier, which is the quantity of grain in pounds that must be fed to animals to get a pound of meat. So we can think about, okay, how inefficient are we in feeding animals versus actually just eating the grain? So if we take a look, beef is 7. So that means we could get 7 times the amount of food from just the amount of beef that we get. We could get 7 times the amount in crops and in grains. And so this is the quantity of grain in pounds more specifically. And then for chickens, 2.7. So for every pound of beef we eat, people could be eating 7 pounds of grain. Now, ultimately, though, this is not the only problem that causes starvation. The real problem is unequal distribution rather than absolute unavailability. The food's produced, but not everyone has access because of logistical reasons, wars, partly because of choices we make as how it is used. So people can't always simply afford to buy food. And they also may not be able to buy enough or adequately nutritious foods, which honestly can't be solved by just planting more. It's expensive. And so people have those problems, and is that causes starvation. So next up, if we take a look at overall food production, we can take a look at this left side here, and it looks like calories per capita per day that are produced, and then there's the percent of global population that's undernourished. So if I go ahead and pull out my annotation tool here, if we look, we have this blue line right here that I'm for some reason making yellow. This is how much we're producing in per capita per day. And then the recommended caloric intake per capita per day is this amount. And remember, per capita just means per person. And then percent of global population undernourished is actually decreasing here according to this axis. Now, this axis actually this red line has to do with this right scale right here. So it goes from 0 to 20%, and it seems as though it's gone down from 18% to about 10% undernourished. So that's quite impressive, but we can also look at, well, the population has been growing at around 19, right about here, 1998 is when the world hit 6 billion people. 6 billion people. And then over here, we're almost at 8. This is like 7.5-ish billion people. So the amount of people has actually increased, and yet our undernourished population has still decreased. And that is a lot because of calorie production. But undernourishment is still present, and we could get this down to zero if we just distributed the resources better. And so we can see that the caloric intake that we've produced has gone from 2,600 to above 2,800, so about like 2,900-ish here, uh, calories per capita per day. That's how many we produce. And then we have consumption of meat, which if we take a look at the grain multiplier, we can see here that when it comes to per capita consumption of meat, so how many kilograms of meat are we consuming? We see that of beef, India consumes 1 kilogram of beef per capita per year. And then in pork, zero point 0.4, poultry, 1, mutton, 1, and then the total per year is 3.4. And then this actually tells us the multiplier here. Let me circle it for you. This is the grain multiplier. You can't see it very well because it's yellow, but grain multiplier is right there, and it continues on forward through these. And so we can see that beef is 7, pork is 3, poultry is 2, and then mutton is sheep. That's not a grain multiplier, obviously, but we can see that India clearly has the least beef that's eaten, and then China eats 42 kilograms, which four kilograms of beef, 30 of pork, so 30. China is actually eating a lot of pork, and then 6 of poultry and 2 of mutton, and then 42 kilograms total. Italy eats 26 kilograms of beef per capita per year. 33, 19 poultry, 20 or 2 for mutton, and then 45 for beef, 31 for pork, 46 for poultry, and then 1 for mutton. So, and then notice the 123, that's 270 pounds there. And a lot of this consumption of meat also has to do, also causes greenhouse gas emissions, which are significant in this case. And so, if we take a look here, this is actually a really good chart to try and memorize or to do flashcards on perhaps and fill out a chart for yourself to try and memorize, okay, well, we know US is going to be the greatest in all except for pork and mutton. Italy actually eats the most pork. They eat a lot of pork, and then we eat the most in poultry and beef. And so we can then continue forward. So now we're going to move on to we talked about traditional agriculture, but now we're going to talk about conventional land use and planting techniques. So first we're going to talk about mechanism and intensive working of the soil. So in modern Western agriculture, we've started to use mechanization in order to do agriculture. And this is one of the greatest changes that we've had. So this includes tractors, harvesters, and other machines, which actually perform a lot of the processes needed for farming, and from plowing to tilling to planting and harvesting. So all these machines actually do all the work for us. Processes like transportation, processing, and storage of food are also more mechanized than they were 100 years ago. So in the last century, a lot of mechanics are very important in how farming has changed. What does plowing and tilling do? Well, it loosens the soil so that it can be planted and it aerates it. And when it's turned over annually, the drainage and root penetration are improved. Seeds germinate more easily, so they're able to reproduce more. And the some light tilling over time allows burying weeds, so getting rid of weeds without the use of pesticides, and at the same time adding organic matter in the weeds to the soil. So we're taking out the weeds, we're tilling them, and we're making sure that the weeds are now a part of the soil and giving that organic matter to the soil to help the crops that actually are supposed to be supported there. And usually, large-scale agriculture keeps areas of soils uncovered for periods of time, normally using tilling techniques that do this. And then, if heavy rains or windy, dry periods occur before seedlings are established, the soil is susceptible to erosion. So if you don't plant the seeds in time for heavy rains or windy, dry periods to happen, erosion is going to happen. Erosion happens in heavy rains or windy, dry periods. Now, about 16% of soil has been lost to erosion in both developed and developing countries. And uh, heavy machinery has compacted the soil, which counteracts some of the benefits of tilling. So tilling can like aerate the soil and so forth. But in this case, if you use heavy machinery, it compacts the soil, and so we don't get those benefits of tilling. And if the soil is plowed or tilled, however, these soil particles that were so if soil particles were attached to one another, these are broken up more, and plant roots are distributed more, and they're all more susceptible to movement by wind or water now if they're tilled. But if it compacts the soil with the heavy machinery, then that's going to happen less. And so there's kind of this difference in balance in positive and negative benefits to each. Now, plowing can have significant effects. So some say that it's the greatest consequences of all agricultural practices. So plowing to some has the greatest consequences, according to some. And soils, they can take a lot of time, take hundreds or thousands of years to develop into organic matter, which in which those soil horizons form, which we talked about earlier in one of the early videos. And in natural systems, the plants die and decompose, and so their nutrients go into the soil and they enrich the soil. So things we've talked about already. Plants die, they decompose, they get into the soil, they make it better for planting and enrich it, and they become part of biogeochemical cycles. However, in agriculture, farmers often remove the bulk of byproducts of an agricultural crop from the soil so it won't interfere. And so they have to then monitor the amount of carbon in the soil, the SOC, and they actually see that, so that's soil organic carbon, I'm pretty sure. See that or agricultural fields, they have less SOC over time. Now, if a field is left alone, the SOC will build back up again. But notice, usually this organic matter needs time for soils to form. And usually plants die and decompose, but in this case, a lot of the agricultural crop is taken out, all the byproducts, so the soil won't have those nutrients and SOCs, and then the agricultural fields are left in somewhat ruins. So approximately 40% of cropland in the use worldwide has been degraded to some degree by erosion, compaction, or waterlogging and salinization. So salinization is making it more salty. But notice we said up here, where did we say it? 16%. 16% of soil has been lost to erosion, but 40% has been degraded. And so we've had because of compaction or waterlogging and salinization. And if we were to do certain things like alternate proportions of previously cultivated land, if we were to just put it to the side and stop planting crops in those areas and allow it to lie fallow, which is idle during the growing season, we could probably improve the health of the soil in the agricultural areas. But this would have a short-term negative impact on food production. So people may not want to do this in that case because it would temporarily decrease food production. So next up, we get to talk about irrigation. And so we can affect the soil using irrigation, which is the artificial addition of moisture, usually in large quantities of water pumped from a river, lake, or underlying aquifer. So we see, well, we're using water more now again, and we talked about irrigation in the previous video about water. And so in parts of the world where food supply is limited by the amount of rainfall, the irrigation can actually increase growth rates. So, in places with lower rainfall, irrigation helps with growth rates. Even if crops would not be or would usually be traditionally absent, we can then grow them in places that previously wouldn't have worked. And so we take a look at some of these types of irrigation here. This is what they look like. The most efficient is drip irrigation, as we talked about, which has a 95% effectiveness, and 60% effectiveness is traditional irrigation. If we go back here to the water section, transport of water right here. So, no, not here. Here it is. 60% efficient is conventional irrigation, and drip irrigation is 95% efficient. So then we were talking about how, oh, irrigation has allowed for 1 million acres of former desert in the Imperial Valley of southeastern California. So very close to where we live. Like think of like, yeah, our area, southeastern California. We have a lot of fruits and vegetables that we produce during the winter for lots of parts of the country, despite us being in a constant drought. And so we've turned 1 million acres. Now, remember how many um, hectares were, or how many hectares made up, which is 2.47 acres, made up all agricultural land? Well, it was just about 5 billion, I believe. 5 billion hectares, yep. 50 million square kilometers makes up all agricultural land. And so we're making up a whole lot here in the Imperial Valley of southeastern California of fruits and vegetables. And so uh, a 2016 estimate says that 20% of world agricultural land is irrigated, but 40%, or the land produces 40% of global food. So 20% is irrigated, but this land makes up 40% of all global food production, which is about, as we said earlier, 2,900 calories per uh, capita of all people. And so irrigation allows for both large-scale agribusinesses and organic farming. Uh, both groups can use irrigation. And however, it can actually have negative consequences, such as depleting the underlying groundwater table and drawing down aquifers so that neighboring wells run dry. So, if we have a lot of irrigation, then that means it's going to mostly have effects in that groundwater. And so it's drawing down the aquifers, which means that it's bringing out the water from the other aquifers, and other wells will run dry because we're taking irrigation from those areas. We're taking water from those other areas and bringing it to another area, and therefore those wells will run dry. Now, monocropping, which is a single crop species or monoculture, being planted in a large area. So just one crop in one large area. And a lot of large-scale agriculture in the US is based on monocultures, which is hundreds of acres stretched and cultivated with such things such as soybeans or corn. And remember, soybeans are one of the 8 crops which make up the other important human diet parts, versus the 80% of the calories come from wheat, rice, maize, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and manioc. And so we see that soybeans and corn are usually monocrop or monocultures, and they are being planted with monocultures even in developing countries, which there are places which previously haven't had any agriculture, uh, or they were just used for subsistence agriculture, subsistence meaning just supporting to be able to eat rather than just large scale production. And now monocultures are starting to supplant that. And so in central Kenya, we're actually using good farmland for growing tea, even though, uh, well, no, not even though. Central Kenya is for growing tea, while in Western Kenya, uh, it was previously not farmed, but now it's covered with wheat fields. Now, one advantage to monoculture is everything can be treated identically. It can all receive the same plowing, planting, fertilizer, pesticide application, watering, and harvesting, and so forth. And so now farmers can sow seeds, apply fertilizer or pesticides, or even harvest crops for an entire day without changing the settings on the tractor. So we have all these conveniencies, which we have pesticide application, everything gets the same. Watering and harvesting, everything is the same because it's one crop. And so we don't even need to change the settings on tractors and compounds that are being applied. So this allows to what's known as an economy of scale. It's more energy and dollar efficient to grow one crop on 100 acres than grow a number of different crops in the same area. So this is more efficient for an economy, is monocultures is more efficient economically speaking for these economies of scale, more energy and dollar efficient. However, the main disadvantage is that there's less crop diversity and there's therefore vulnerability to pests and diseases. So all one crop means if a pest comes that can destroy one crop, it can destroy all the crops. So, for example, Colorado potato beetle. It's a major pest for the potato plant foliage. However, it doesn't feed on other foliage. So if it if a potato beetle comes into a farmland of a bunch of potatoes in a potato monoculture, then all of the potatoes would be destroyed. But if there's multiple species, 3 or 4 different species, then all the non-potatoes would survive. So potato beetles eat potatoes only. It's like they only have one food that they like, and they're like, yum, yum, potatoes. And so those Colorado potato beetles are kind of crazy. But our monoculture kind of encourages them in a way. Then we can begin talking about chemical fertilizers. And so usually the plant essential nutrients, remember, we talked about some of these earlier on about micro and macronutrients, and that is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are plant essential nutrients for that are used in fertilizers. And remember nitrogen and oh, I scrolled too far. Nitrogen and phosphorus here. Let's scroll back down. Nitrogen and phosphorus are good for BODs. They're not good, but produce oxygen demanding waste because of bacteria. And then there's potassium. Uh, and all of these are in contrast to organic fertilizers, which actually, how do you make organic fertilizers that we talked about earlier? Well, we compost vegetation and animal wastes. And chemical fertilizers that are used by modern agribusinesses are synthesized by human beings within the fossil fuel energy. So these fossil fuel energy is used to create chemical fertilizers. And this is one of the contrast to organic fertilizers, because organic fertilizers are used in traditional farming, which are created by composting vegetation and animal waste. And then synthetic processes, they usually entail combusting natural gas into the atmosphere. So once again, fossil fuel energy and capturing the nitrogen that's fixed. So we capture the nitrogen by combusting natural gas into the atmosphere, and that's how we create these chemical fertilizers. But in the process, uh, we are releasing these gases into the atmosphere. Now, we might use machinery to grind up rock in order to obtain materials within. And that's another way which we can get this nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Now, synthetic chemical fertilizers have actually increased crop yields, as we talked about for the Green Revolution, and fertilizer use has increased from 20 million metric tons to over 200 million metric tons between 1960 and 2020. However, food production has actually increased more than fertilizers have. And so we could say that without these synthetic fertilizers, we probably couldn't feed people in the world. However, fertilizer also is responsible for a bunch of the runoff from agricultural fields into adjacent rivers, streams, and other waterways, including aquifers. So remember, there's non-point sources of water pollution. And usually compost has a slow release of nutrients, whereas synthetic fertilizers release the nutrients more rapidly. And so if these nutrients are very rapidly given to the soil, since plants can take up only certain amounts at a time, if everything's being rushed into the plants all at once through these synthetic fertilizers, then a lot of the nutrients is going to sit there in the soil and then it'll eventually be leached away by water, which means it's get pulled out of the soil by water, and then it ends up as runoff. And so this is another non-point source of water pollution. And so organic matter, chemical fertilizers don't actually add organic matter or contribute to the soil structure as organic fertilizers such as humus or compost do. So remember what humus is, it's that organic material that goes inside of the O layer of the soil horizons. And so we see that it doesn't add anything, it doesn't contribute to the organic fertilizers. Chemical fertilizers do not. And synthetic chemical fertilizers, as we said earlier, use fossil fuels and release fossil carbon into the atmosphere. So next up, we can actually start to talk about chemical pesticides. So we talked about chemical fertilizers. Now we're talking about pesticides. So these are substances that are neither natural or synthetic, and they kill organisms that are considered pests to people. So most common are insecticides, which target insects, and then herbicides, which kill off vegetation that competes with the commercial species, the ones that we want to grow. So, for example, in monoculture, you might use an herbicide to eliminate all other types of plants. Also, look at this really sad image. Like this is very sad. Just take a look at this for a second. I saw this earlier and I was like, wow, this is, this is a really, really sad image. Anyways, so pesticides used by agricultural businesses are usually petrochemicals, which means they're synthesized from petroleum. So petroleum is the base for these chemical pesticides. Now, usually it's a period of time to which the chemical pesticides eliminate those pests after the application, but the pesticide can dissipate and the pests then rebound and recover. And then there's more application needed. And eventually, if you use pesticides enough, the insects and other pests will build up a resistance because they adapt. And so they see, oh my goodness, we're so scared of this pesticide, we're gonna die now. But then they're like, wait a minute. I've seen this chemical before. I don't need to be scared of it anymore. I'm gonna fight right back. I don't care about you chemical pesticides. Okay. So, for example, this would then mean that stronger chemicals are needed in order to kill them, and then the process continues. Now, one example of an herbicide, glyphosate, which is usually called Roundup. So you may be asked a question like, what is the herbicide technical name of Roundup? And it is glyphosate. And so this is usually used to control perennial plants such as grasses and broad-leaved herbaceous species and trees. But because it's a general or broad spectrum herbicide, it basically kills every vegetation that you put it on. And so that wouldn't be very good. That's not very fun that there can be many species targeted and glyphosate just destroys literally everything and you don't exactly want that. Now, then there's insecticides, which can actually kill insects, which are considered pests, but it also kills some organisms that are actually really good for the crops. And so we end up in this situation where we're like, oh no, we're killing the crops that we actually really like. And so in the year 2020, about 400,000 tons of pesticides were actually applied to food crops, cotton, and fruit trees, which is more than any other country. So 400,000 tons of pesticides were sprayed on all of these things, which is more than any other country, except Brazil wasn't too far behind with 375,000 tons, although we were 25,000 tons more. And uh, this includes 300 million pounds of herbicide and 24 million pounds of insecticide. So if we take a look at the reference here, I'm going to actually open this real quick because I want to check something related to the whether that 374 is for the US or Brazil. So if we take a look here, oh, doesn't seem to be open. I'll have to check on that later. But anyways, you may get a question on 300 million pounds of herbicide and 74 million pounds of insecticide. Now, just like fertilizers do, chemical pesticides run off of surface water and then they become potentially go to groundwater. And so these pesticides can actually, it's been debated whether they hurt humans or not. So farm workers, ground workers, and others who apply the pesticides are actually at a greater risk of exposure to a lot of these active ingredients, especially if they don't have safety equipment. So if someone doesn't have safety equipment and they're going out and spraying all these pesticides, they have the exposure of high doses to active ingredients or high doses to all the bad pesticides. And so The EPA actually says that there are probably about 20,000 physician-treated pesticide poisoning occurs that occur each year among 3.8 million US agricultural workers. So this is how many agricultural workers there are. Now, we don't know how many poisonings are actually going undiagnosed and untreated, but 20,000 are being treated out of the 3.8 million US agricultural workers. Okay. So next up, we're going to talk about the high density farming of animals. So also, in addition to producing plant crops, this here says that modern agribusinesses often involve farming heavy livestock. So over recent years, 10 billion animals annually, so every year, 10 billion animals are raised and slaughtered for food in the US. 9 billion of these are chickens. So 9 of the 10 billion animals that are raised and slaughtered, chickens. And so they use antibiotics and nutrient supplements in order to increase the density of these animals in a confined area, and they reduce sunlight and exposure to the outdoors without the adverse health effects and diseases that would normally occur in a lot of these animals. And so the high density animal farming, this includes feedlot beef cattle, dairy cows, pigs, and chickens. So feedlot beef cattle, dairy cows, so cattle and cattle, but in different forms. So feedlot beef cattle, feed, you are trying to feed with the beef, and then you are trying to get dairy from the cows, and then you are pigs and chickens. And they're all given very little room for movement in their life cycle. And so feedlot farming of animals. So high density farming, feedlot is actually the action here. So they feedlot beef cattle, dairy cows, pigs, and chickens. And this allows for high output of meat in a small area of land. So that's, as we saw here, very, very sad. And so it actually has a lot of environmental and health consequences. So there's a lot of manure and urine accumulate in these areas, which has to be removed on a regular basis, but isn't usually disposed of properly, or not always. So there's a lot of poop, and we don't dispose it correctly all the time. And sometimes the wastes are stored in lagoons adjacent to the feedlots. You just dump the waste into the pond. Imagine going swimming in the lagoon and there's just a bunch of poop in there. That's kind of gross. And during heavy rains, this runoff contaminates the nearby waterways. They've also, either inadvertently or intentionally, both, into public waters too. So even chicken farms in Maryland, uh, they have been found to dump chicken waste into local rivers, which eventually feed into Chesapeake Bay and thus contribute to infectious disease outbreaks as well as nitrogen pollution. So a lot of nitrogen is being dumped in, and we talked about that earlier in the water section. And we talked about infectious disease outbreaks. And so the EPA has said that hog, chicken, and cattle waste has actually polluted around 35,000 million or 5,000 35,000 miles of rivers in 22 states and contaminated groundwater in 17 states. So 22 of the states of the United States, 35,000 miles of rivers, and 17 states, the groundwater has been contaminated from this. Now, antibiotics in animal feed transferred to humans could produce antibiotic resistant strains of microorganisms that develop in humans. So, if we give antibiotics to the animals, that the bacteria in them will produce a resistance, and thus those animals then transfer the bacteria over to us, which we then have those antibiotic resistant microorganisms. Not just that, but there are other ramifications for human health as a result of high density animal farming. So animal farming doesn't just have the problem of transferring over antibiotic resistant strains and dumping waste into places like the Chesapeake Bay. It can also hurt. Then we have GMOs, which a lot of these we call frankenfoods, such as square tomatoes and animals that grow in the dark. All of these are popular reactions, so just what people think of when they think of GMOs or genetically modified organisms. Genetic modification has been going on actually for 10,000 years, near the start of agriculture. And Darwin even wrote about it in the first chapter of his On the Origin of Species. So, like, what was the first chapter of On the Origin of Species about? Well, it was about exactly this. It was about genetic modification and how it's been going on for 10,000 years. So, some people breed domesticated species in order to maintain certain traits and then let others diminish through artificial selection. So, artificial selection is where you're selecting certain traits that you desire, such as in a golden retriever that was breeded for specific traits. And other foods that we often eat, such as cabbage, broccoli, collards, and others, have all been a result of artificial selection. And so, um, why are we afraid of GMOs when we eat seedless watermelon? Well, it's because it may be reasonable to have concerns about uh, genetically modified crops, but in order to understand this, we need to understand the biology behind, well, what is genetic modification? So, usually people modify plants and animals by just taking the species with desired traits and interbreeding them, such as hardiness, to interbreed them to create hybrids, they are known as. So this is when you breed strains of the same species in or with the desired traits that you want, and they then have the traits that you want because you're breeding them. And so an example of this is transferring pollen. So pollen is just cells that contain a lot of genes between a plum and apricot, which is both the genus Prunus. And so this creates the hybrids of plumcot and pluot. So these are hybrids in which we are interbreeding strains to get two different desired traits out of them, or multiple, versus genetic engineering isolates a specific gene from one organism and transfers it to the genetic material of another organism. So, two different kingdoms of life here when in genetic engineering, where you take one gene and plant it in another, versus hybrids and artificial selection usually take from the same species. So, first, let's take a look at an example. So, one problem with corn is that the bollworm likes to attack the corn. And so the bollworm, the European corn borer, and other insects all attack corn. So bollworm and the corn borer. So those are two, the bees. They both attack the corn. So B, C, they attack the C. Uh, Bacillus thuringiensis is a natural soil bacteria that repels these insects. So this bacteria has the gene that repels the insects, which is known as BT, or the bacteria's insecticidal gene. So remember insecticides? Well, this is like a gene that's like an insecticide in itself. And so this genetic material can be inserted into plants. And so the corn plant then has insecticides in its leaves. And actually, by 2002, 34% of all corn that was planted in the US was BT corn, which is that corn which has that uh, BT gene from the bacteria in it. And almost all of this is fed to livestock. And it's actually toxic to corn borers and bollworms, and it's been confirmed. And so you can then use less synthetic pesticide on corn plants. Also, genetic engineering has been able to make plants that are resistant to Roundup. So this is called the Roundup Ready gene, and it's been used in corn, soybean, and cotton plants. And this allows them to spray herbicide all over their fields without destroying the plants that they want to plant. So they have they destroy the weeds while keeping the other crops in. But in this case, there's less weed control through tilling, and then erosion is thus reduced. So if we till less and there's less weed control through that method, then the erosion is reduced. However, glyphosate, the Roundup, is actually then introduced a ton into the environment. So as we were saying, the chemical glyphosate can then be introduced in the environment, which can be bad. But genetic engineering also allows for these traits, these genetic changes to um, be, well, genetic engineering allows for the rapid acquisition of desirable traits, and in some cases, acquisition of traits that might not otherwise be transferable. So genetic engineering allows for certain traits to transfer to other organisms where they usually wouldn't be able to. So, for example, the cold tolerance in strawberry plants, it has some variation among certain individuals, but genetic engineering has allowed it to have greater cold tolerance gene to be spliced into a strawberry plant. So this cold tolerance gene is going to allow more of the individuals to also have that trait. Now, genetically engineering crops actually show, well, we can probably produce less waste because we're using less pesticides and greater efficiency and higher profits for agribusinesses that use them then. And they can reduce world hunger by reducing the loss to pests and environmental conditions, while all the while producing increasing output. But there is some controversy, and that includes that some people believe that GMOs can be or may be harmful, even though there's little evidence to support these concerns, that they can be harmful to human beings. And so, uh, researchers are still studying this possibility that if people eat the foods that contain the genes that are transferred from a food that they are allergic to. So if there's a food that has a gene that someone might use in a different crop, and then someone eats that crop, researchers are investigating whether that crop will cause an allergic reaction in someone who is allergic to the crop that the gene came from. And so there's also concerns for what if plants accidentally get out into the natural environment and GMOs are uh, grown much more in the natural environment other than their agricultural locations. And so there could be some harmful effects, such as the mortality in non-target organisms. So, like the organisms may be affected even if they weren't originally targeted by the GMOs themselves. So, like one example of this is the monarch butterfly dying because or monarch butterfly caterpillars dying from ingesting the pollen from BT corn. So the BT corn is causing these caterpillars to die. Even though corn isn't the favored food of the monarchs, um, they they're unlikely to take in a lot of corn pollen. It's possible that the pollen could be spread to fields of corn, to milkweed plants, which are the usual food of the monarchs. And uh, so this could show a correlation of BT corn harming the monarchs, but this has actually shown little effect on the caterpillars. Now, those opposing GMOs also worry that soil organisms that are beneficial to crops will be killed as a result of genetically modified crops because of the new toxins that are created by them. And another fear is if the crop plants can breed with wild relatives, then these genes will spread to the wild plants. And so they'll alter or eliminate even natural varieties. So natural varieties will just be gone and they'll be outcompeted by the uh, genetically modified crops and maybe even be naturally selected for. Now, there are efforts to create these things called buffer zones around GMO crops, so that no wild species of the crops can be found outside of those GMO areas. But pollen, alas, travels through the wind, so it doesn't always respect borders. And so this one method for this would be to make the GMO crops sterile, and so their seeds are non-viable and they can't reproduce. Whereas wild varieties then will not be able to reproduce with them because they're sterile. And so there are some more negatives and positives that actually GMOs were certain about. So that's including a genetically modified seed actually already contributes to loss of genetic diversity in food crops. So if you're changing genes, then that genetic diversity is going to decrease because if you're selecting for a very specific gene, then you're going to have less of more genes in the gene pool. And overall, genetically modified seeds have increased year by year. So by 2002, 34% of all corn, 75% of soybeans, 71% of cotton, all of these came from modified seeds. Now, we talked about the BT corn already coming up as 34%, but these new numbers that we need to memorize now are 75% of soybeans and 71% of cotton. And so these come from genetically modified seeds. And then by 2020, they all reached to over 90% for all of these crops. So for these three crops, for corn, soybeans, and cotton, they all of these have reached over 90%. And so this doesn't just contribute to overall loss of biodiversity, but it also means that the crop production is now susceptible to insect infestations similar to monocultures. So since they all seem to have less biodiversity, then they're gonna be more susceptible since they have similar genes to insect infestations since they're all very similar. And thus there's a reduction in the actual production of these crops. And so this is similar to monocultures, as we said. And even though they have these negative effects, they actually have had a positive impact in decreasing the pesticide use in creating insect-resistant strains of crops. So then we finally get to talk about sustainable agriculture. And so we're going to ask, can we support the world population without destroying the land, polluting the environment, or reducing biodiversity? And so the idea of sustainable agriculture all attempts to combine these things: economic viability with reduced environmental impact. So we're trying to create sustainable, both economically and environmentally, agriculture. And so, can we use agriculture on a single piece of land indefinitely, forever and ever, and conserve the soil and create integrated pest management? So a lot of sustainable farmers are actually using traditional farming techniques because a lot of those are sustainable. Now, intercropping allows crops to grow among other species, and this is one of the traditional farming techniques. But intercropping trees with vegetable crops, also sometimes called agroforestry, this allows for vegetation of different heights to act as windbreaks to stop erosion from happening and allowing the soil to just stay in place rather than being carried away and blown by the wind. And so a lot of farmers in East Africa have planted trees next to vegetable crops. So you'll have rows of trees and rows of vegetables, rows of trees, rows of vegetables, and so forth. And so some of the soil will be removed, and soil particles, however, will only travel a few feet to the rows of trees. And then the soil is captured, and so we have less erosion. Another means of land preparation is conserving the soil. So contour plowing is plowing and harvesting parallel to the topographic contours of the land. So the way the land rises and falls, we can plant according to those contours in the land. And this allows for less erosion while also gaining practical advantages of plowing. So we can plow just as those help with agriculture and plow according to a way that will help the environment by keeping erosion at a low. So, um, crop farmers may plant a winter wheat during a time when the fields would normally be unplanted so that the land does not remain uncovered. So, in order to keep from erosion from happening during the winter, they might grow winter wheat in order not to just produce more food, but in order to stop the erosion from happening in the soil and making sure it doesn't remain uncovered. And then another approach to this, which is still under development, is using perennial crops. So they don't have to be replanted every year, they just keep growing back. And so this has actually improved the ability of the soil to retain carbon. So remember those SOCs in the carbon, keeping those is good for agriculture. And so through conventional farming methods, we can actually allow for soil to retain carbon. However, this carbon does become a part of the increase in atmospheric carbon levels, so we do need to watch those as well. So that was agriculture, and I hope you enjoyed this one. And the next word for this video is going to be written. So thank you.